Good afternoon, and thank you to everyone for attending today's Diversity Speaks Lunch and Learn, featuring Dr. Kyaien Connor, PhD, LSW, and NPH, entitled Intersecting Legacies, Racism's Enduring Impact on Community Health and Mental Health Disparities. Before we begin our program, though, I would like to invite our Executive Director, Chad Dion Lassiter, to offer welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Deputy Director Chang. Good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this virtual space. I want to first and foremost acknowledge ASL. We are always blessed and fortunate to have you here. It is a science to have ASL here. I wanted to open up with a quote from Marian Wright Elderman, who was the founder and president of the Children's Defense Fund. She articulates the following. Service is the rent we pay for being. It is the very purpose of life and not something you do in your spare time. She also had another quote where she said, "You can't be what you can't see." I'm honored and humbled that we have a brilliant social justice warrior here. Sometimes people throw out the terms like friend or colleagues, but this person is truly a friend. If anyone knows me, I'm very, very particular on who I let in to be members of my tribe. And this brilliant individual is a sister. She's a social justice warrior. She's a friend of mine. Your executive director was fortunate to be tapped by her, as well as the dean of the School of Social Work at the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work, to do their commencement address just last year. I was one of their participants in their conceived and very well organized Beloved Community Conference. And we're in the midst of getting ready to do another Beloved Community Conference in November of 2026 with none other than Dr. Bernice King. I end here, Deputy Director Chang, before I get too emotional, but this person that's getting ready to present to us inspires a whole western part of the state, but also people throughout the state and throughout the continent of Africa, primarily in Senegal. And so I want to say to you, my dear sister, my dear friend, thank you for being in this space. Thank you for pouring into me. And thank you for all that you do for social work students who will be the next vanguard of social change agents, hopefully reimagine our democracy from what it is now to what it can be, the promise of a better democracy. So Deputy Director Chang, we turn it back over to you, and everyone put on your metaphoric seatbelts and get ready to go for a social justice ride, because it's going to be powerful and palpable.
Thank you so much, Edie. And that was the perfect segue to this incredible bio. Before I turn it over to you, Dr. Connor, I have to share with the audience just your incredible resume. So, Dr. Kyaien Connor, PhD, LSW, and full professor in the Donald M. Henderson Endowed Chair at the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work, where she also serves as the Associate Dean for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Dr. Connor is also the director of the Center on Race and Social Problems, an academic research center which conducts applied social science research on race, color, ethnicity, and their influence on quality of life. Dr. Connor is a clinical social worker by profession. She is the former clinical director of the Boris L. Henson Foundation, the Black Mental Health Foundation founded by actress Taraji P. Henson, and currently serves on their clinical advisory board. She also serves on the board of Passport Academy and Age Friendly Greater Pittsburgh. Dr. Connor's research specifically investigates the factors that influence disparities in health and mental health service utilization and treatment outcomes for racial and ethnic minorities. She focuses on the development and evaluation of culturally meaningful approaches to improving behavioral health for African Americans as a strategy for eliminating the health disparities in Black and Brown communities in the U.S. Dr. Connor's interest in mental health and disparities is rooted in her professional and clinical experience. Her training in structural determinants of health has aided in her development and enhancement of evidence-based interventions with culturally relevant enhancements to reduce health disparities for racial and ethnic minority adults. As principal investigator, Dr. Connor has received over $5 million in funding for her research on behavioral health disparities. As PI or co-PI, she has brought in over $13 million in funding for innovative research. She has received many awards for her work, including Pittsburgh Women of Excellence 2025, Distinguished Alumni Award in 2023, Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Civic and Community Engagement in 2022, Black Faculty Member of the Year in 2021, and that is just to name a few. Dr. Connor presents nationally on issues regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion, and anti-racism and race-based trauma. Dr. Connor wrote a bill that was signed into law on June 17, 2021 to restructure the Florida State Office of Minority Health and Health Equity, also referred to as Senate Bill 404, which was sponsored by State Senator Darrell Rusin. The overarching goal of her research and praxis is health equity and social justice. And so it is my true distinct honor to turn the floor over to you, Dr. Connor.
Well, thank you all so much. I am honored and privileged to be here today. I always feel somewhat shy when my resume is read, but we work hard to do the social justice work that we do, and that work deserves to be identified and reflected. And I appreciate it. And Edie Lassiter, to hear you talk so affectionately about me and our friendship means I have made it. I appreciate it so much, and to be in your circle and the work that you do means everything to me. So thank you all so much for inviting me to this lunch and learn today. To talk about some really important topics, but also difficult topics. And I think, as we're right on the verge of Black History Month. And as we move into this month, we recognize that it needs to not only be a celebration of how far we've come, of our resilience and achievement, but it's also an opportunity for us to examine the structural forces that have shaped the lived experience of Black communities across generations. Health and mental health disparities do not arise in isolation. They are rooted in historical injustices, in discriminatory policies, and ongoing inequities that are embedded within our institutions. Racism as a structural and historical determinant of health is incredibly important, and it's not just about what's happening with regard to individual communities' behaviors, but really thinking about this as a systemic issue. So understanding these intersecting legacies allows us to move beyond just individual explanations and towards more systemic approaches that promote equity. Solutions have to address both structural change and culturally grounded, community-led strategies that can rebuild trust and strengthen pathways to health. So this presentation will really center community voice. It will center historical truth and a commitment to equity, healing, and justice. And that also means that a portion of it is going to be difficult to hear. It's not going to all be roses and flowers, but we have to be aware so that we can find the correct and most effective path towards action. And so that's where we'll get at the end of the presentation. You heard about me, so I'm not going to go through any additional details about my past and my experiences. I just want to frame very quickly, again, as a licensed clinical social worker that is also a professional academic scholar and researcher. These are the lenses that I bring to this presentation, along with my own personal and lived experience from myself, my family, and my communities. And it is with that lens that I talk about these issues and topics. I will be talking about history, but I am not a historian. But it's important for us to understand our history so that we can have the correct path towards where we're going. I also recognize that as a professor, I tend to be long-winded, and we're already 10 minutes into the presentation, and I haven't even gotten through the agenda. So one of the things I did know, because I teach an entire semester on this topic, so to put this into an hour is tough. I put a lot more on the slides than I'll actually be able to talk through. And that was intentional so that I could provide these slides to anyone in this space who is interested in having more detail and information, so that you can look through this more on your own, and we can have hopefully further conversations as we move through. But this is sort of my plan to really talk a bit at the beginning about why history matters as we think about health equity, to talk a bit about race, racism, and its indirect and direct impacts on health and health outcomes historically, but also thinking about today, the contemporary inequities that we see. And then importantly, beginning to move from how we describe these disparities to responsibility and accountability. What is working? How can we ensure that our communities are able to thrive? What can all of us do in our various spaces to help make this shift a reality? And then really hoping for some time for discussion and Q&A at the end. I'll intersect a little bit on some of my research projects that are active right now that are in my mind working to address some of these things, but won't have enough time to go into that in detail, but hoping to share a little bit. So as we think about why history matters for health equity, the health of individuals and communities today is profoundly shaped by the structures, policies, and social conditions that were created in the past. Health disparities are not natural, they are not random or inevitable, they are the predictable outcomes of historical decisions that distributed resources and opportunities and risks unequally across racial and social groups in our country. Health is shaped most profoundly by where people live, where they learn, where they work, and where they play. These conditions that we often call the social determinants of health were formed through policies, right? Redlining and housing segregation, segregated and unequal education, discriminatory labor practices. These historical choices still structure who has access to healthcare, clean air, safe housing, transportation, food, and economic mobility. In addition, we know that racism has had long-term biological and psychological effects. Decades of unequal treatment, discrimination, and chronic stress have measurable impacts on the body. A variety of things, including elevated cortisol levels, increased allostatic load, which I'll talk about a little bit later, earlier onset of chronic illness, and what we call the weathering effect, which accelerates aging and disease progression in Black and brown bodies. Further, medical racism has created mistrust that has also shaped health outcomes historically and currently. Events like forced sterilization, segregated hospitals, discriminatory medical research practices have all left legacies of mistrust that affect healthcare utilization, communities' willingness to participate in research, access to early detection and treatment services. So again, these legacies don't just disappear, they continue to influence behavior and institutional culture. Many of the institutions and policies that were created under these historical discriminatory frameworks are still functioning today, sometimes with new language, but with the same inequitable outcomes. So without understanding these historical roots, it can become very easy to misinterpret contemporary disparities as their problem, as the community's issue, as those folks' individual behaviors, rather than recognizing the structural nature of those disparities. So, as E.D. Lassiter said in his introductory remarks, you can't change things that you're unable to or unwilling to see. So focusing on our history helps us to identify why these disparities exist, recognize that inequities are preventable, and then hopefully to avoid repeating these harmful patterns in the future. I know we're not going to go into depth on this. We all know what race means, but I always find it helpful to just talk a little bit at the beginning of these presentations about this, because to talk about legacies of racism, we have to first ensure that we're all talking about race and using the same language, right? We know that race is a social construct that is used differently in different cultures and countries, that is a grouping of humans based on shared physical or social qualities into categories that are generally viewed as distinct by a society. And although we place people into these distinct categories, there is a considerable amount of variability within these groups. It has been useful over time in our history to find ways to categorize and group people. And unfortunately, that has also been led to connected to ability to treat certain groups unfairly. So even though race is a social and not a biological construct, we can still say that race is real, because we live in a very racialized society. It is not real in the sense that we can use the color of one's skin to determine intellect or ability, but it is real in the sense that race can impact experiences and outcomes. Because we as a society have given race power through its social construction, we have given it meaning. And it means something different in every society. However, across all of my travels and my global work around the world, one of the common themes is that whiter is seen as better, and in contrast, darker is seen as less than. And that plays out in a variety of ways that impact experiences of racism and discrimination at multiple levels over one's life course. One of the challenges, and I won't spend long on this, but this is something that's challenging for me as a researcher, is thinking about, well, if we know race is important and we want to be able to look at the impact of race and racism on outcomes, well, we have to measure race somehow. And as a social scientist, I grapple a lot with this. If it's a social construct, how do we measure it? Should we be measuring it? Even for many of you in this room, you may not be a researcher or, a clinician, but think about how many events that we have where we are capturing race. We're doing surveys or evaluations, or we're asking people about their race when they fill out those, how did you feel about this event? And often we're doing that because we are interested in being able to look at differences in outcomes, experiences, perceptions by race, right? But measuring race is complex, and it is powerful, so it is important, but sometimes the way that we're measuring it is actually not helping us to get at what we really want to know. The most common and recommended way that we do this, right, is just asking people how they self-identify. People use either open-ended questions or, right, you've got a multiple choice category, you mark, you check the box. And this is helpful because it reflects how individuals understand their own identity and captures their unique experience. But there are limitations to this. Categories might not fit everyone's identity, and race identity can be context dependent. But most importantly, it also doesn't directly measure exposure to racism. One's race and how one perceives themselves or is perceived by others is different, even though we might all be lumped into the same racial or ethnic category, right? So another approach has been observer-identified race, which is much less common. And this is when researchers or clinicians or someone else classifies a person based upon their appearance or assumptions. This can be really tricky and can be harmful if not handled ethically, right? But why this is important sometimes in healthcare research, I'll give a quick example. There have been a number of studies that have found that Black individuals, for example, who identify as Black but are not perceived as Black by others, have better health outcomes than individuals who themselves don't personally identify as Black but are perceived as Black by others. Does that make sense? So what that really means is that how you identify yourself, yes, that is important, but with respect to health and health outcomes, it can sometimes actually be more important how other people see you, because that has a larger impact on your experiences in your community, with the criminal justice system, with the education system, and with the healthcare system more broadly. So we've been leaning now and moving towards these sort of multi-dimensional race measures, wanting to, yes, recognize the significant importance of individual identity, but also recognizing that racial identity and racialization is complex and multi-layered, and that it's helpful to understand one's experience with racism and discrimination, and not just race, because the important note here that I want to make is that race itself is not causal. Racism is. And that's important. We could look at differences in outcomes by race, but it's not the mere fact of their racial identity that creates the differing outcome, right? It's their experiences that has the impact. And that is a really, really important distinction. I'll use these terms. We've seen these terms. I don't want to spend my time here, but I just think it's important for us to remember that there are multiple different ways that racism as a system is impacting on health and mental health outcomes for our communities. And often we think about interpersonal racism. That's the one we think about most often, those sort of discriminatory beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors expressed between individuals showing up as microaggressions or racial slurs or hate crimes, differential treatment. But we also have structural or institutional racism. These are those policies, the institutional practices and cultural norms that produce and maintain racial inequities with or without explicit racist intent. These are embedded into our institutions. So this can show up with redlining and housing segregation, unequal school funding, discriminatory hiring and promotion practices, environmental racism, unequal access to quality health care. But then there's also this idea of systemic racism, and this is a distinction I want us just to recognize. Systemic racism is the totality of the ways that racism is embedded across our society, in history, in culture, in institutions, policies, and in our collective norms. It captures this broad, interlocking system that has disadvantaged communities of color across multiple levels simultaneously. We can often think about this as the ecosystem of racism that's operating across time and across institutions. And this shows up in a variety of ways. These interconnected legacies of disparity, income, wealth, education, health, housing, and the cultural narratives that normalize inequity in our society. Y'all, there's a lot of normalizing right now going on with respect to what we're experiencing in this country. And there is nothing normal about it. But we have been so accustomed to experiencing and seeing inequities that we can't even recognize it sometimes, even those who are being directly impacted by it. And this is why it makes it so difficult to change. Systemic racism helps to explain why racial inequity is so durable, self-perpetuating, and reproduced through these interlocking systems, not just isolated incidents or individual actions. And they are all working to have an impact on our communities. I don't have a lot of time to talk about this either, but I just want to make a note here because we've talked already and I've mentioned the word bias, unconscious bias. We don't have time to go into that in depth, but it's still important for us to connect to where we begin to develop these biases. And this has a lot to do with our sort of informal and informal racial socialization process that is based upon these historical narratives that have been transmitted over generations and over generations. And when we think about racial socialization, and we have all experienced it, we just don't often know how to call it or what to, the terms to use. But this is the way that we have all been taught over the course of our life by the media, by our caregivers, by our communities, by our teachers, by other children about what race means and what does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be white? And these direct or indirect messages impact how we see ourselves and how we see others, and thus the biases that we end up developing over time. When I was younger and I talk, we all have our own stories around this and things have certainly changed. And, I won't give away my age, but there were no Disney princesses that were Black or that looked exactly like me. And I remember seeing images of like Cinderella, Snow White, and Ariel and wondering why those characters didn't look like me. There were no dolls or Barbies that were darker skinned or had textured hair. And I remember my mother would go very far out of her way to find me a Black baby doll. She would color in the faces of the books I would get from school with crayons to create diversity. We would travel like an hour outside of our community to find the one Black Santa Claus at the mall at Christmas to take pictures with. And these messages, even though I didn't realize it at the time, shaped how I felt about myself and others. I also received other messages from my own community about being lighter skinned or having what we call good hair. And these messages led me to question my own Blackness. And so we're all grappling with these things, right? As well, we know that Black parents often have to socialize their children in different ways, telling their children, don't pick up things at the grocery store so people won't think you've stolen something, helping your child to cope with being taunted or teased because of their hair texture, the color of their skin, or how to be, handle being the only person of color in a class, creating nicknames or alternative names, or going by a middle name to reduce potential bias of employers in the future by having an ethnic sounding name, or teaching their children how to interact with the police so that they can stay alive. I had to have that conversation recently with my two youngest sons who are 10 and 13, and it was heartbreaking, but it was necessary. These messages become ingrained, and then become part of our schema, held in our brain at an unconscious level, that come out quickly when we're exposed to different things. And it can impact our thoughts, decisions, and behaviors without us even being fully aware of it. I want to give one more example. This is a problem for me, y'all. I have all these examples, but I like to share them because it helps to concretize the content for me. I was a part of a really large research project that was called Dismantling Drivers of Racial Inequities in Education. It was funded by the Department of Education before the recent administration took that funding away, but it was a beautiful project. And we were working with teachers and principals across the country to help them, and these were mostly non-Hispanic white teachers, to help them connect to their children in their classrooms of color. And we were doing this through cultural arts and museum tour exposure. So we spent a week in Montgomery, Alabama. And we went to all of the historical sites. We visited the Justice Museum that Brian Stevenson had created, and I saw a principal, white male principal, standing in the corner crying right outside of the mass incarceration space. As a researcher and clinician, that was my job, to check on folks. So I went over, had a conversation with him to see if he was okay. And he shared something so profound with me. He said that it was at that moment in that space where it finally connected to him that the prison system in the United States was reformatted specifically as a pathway to re-enslave freed Black slaves after the emancipation. Up until this point, he had always believed, because he had been socialized to believe, that Black folks just committed more crimes. And even though he was the principal of one of the largest schools in Southern California, in a very liberal community, and identified very highly with Black rights movements, he believed this to his core, that Black folks just committed more crimes because this was the message he had received over the course of his life. And that message was self-reinforced by experiences that he saw on the news, in the paper, in films. Who are the criminals and who are the good guys, right? It wasn't until this moment that he realized that he had been holding on to these beliefs for a very, very long time. But where did these messages come from? Why are we socialized in certain ways about what it means to be Black or white or anything else? And understanding this really does require us to take a step back into history. So I'm going to go through a few slides that help us to understand the connection between history and health and mental health disparities. I'm already noticing the time, so I'm not going to be able to talk about everything on these slides, but I saw the chat message. I will happily share these slides because there's so much here for us to talk about. If we take it all the way back.
And Doc, we'll also build in some additional time if we can. We know that we go for 1 hour, but
Okay.
take your time. And if we go over, for those who can stay, we appreciate it. And for those who can't, we also overstand it or understand it. Okay. So, do your thing.
Thank you. I appreciate it. This is hard for me. We could talk about this for a long time. And it's also important. It's also important. And even though we talk about these things, we don't often go into enough detail to really fully understand the connections. And it's so critical as we think about solutions to understand the full root of the challenges. So when we think about slavery, colonization, we, understand how difficult these times were, right? Enslaved peoples were subjected to forced labor, under extreme physical duress, inadequate housing, starvation level diets, violent punishment. Their bodies were treated as economic property, not as humans, with health needs. These conditions shaped the early health profiles of Black and Indigenous communities in this country and created, as I've mentioned, a legacy of weathering, this accelerated biological aging that occurs due to chronic stress. Medical racism was real during slavery. Enslaved people were often used as the subjects in experimental, unregulated medical procedures. And physicians even built in racialized medical myths. One of the most common being Black people they feel less pain than other groups. And what's really sad, what's really sad is that still exists. And there are still physicians that believe that. that Black folks feel less pain, and that operationalizes in multiple ways, giving Black people less pain medication in the hospital, not believing them when they identify that they are in pain, which leads to a host of negative health outcomes for folks. So these patterns produced ongoing disparities even today. Again, historical roots still impacting what we see right now. Colonization imposed hierarchical racial systems across the Americas, Caribbean, Africa, and Asia, in which European populations, right, extracted labor and land and resources from indigenous and African descended peoples. So this created a number of health impacts that we don't talk a whole lot about. Direct loss of food sovereignty, which connected to malnutrition and led to chronic illness in these communities, exposure to overcrowding and unsanitary conditions, and an ecological degradation that again still persists today. We also saw infectious disease. Colonizers brought diseases to which indigenous peoples had no immunity. So beyond initial mass mortality, the long-term effects included weakened community resilience and disrupted intergenerational knowledge transmission, and of course, significant mental health impacts, intergenerational trauma and collective grief, a loss of cultural identity, and higher rates of depression, death by suicide, and in some communities, substance use and abuse. Another important thing to think about is the rise of scientific racism. Slavery, colonization really gave rise to this set of false theories claiming biological differences among races. And these claims, of course, we know now to be completely untrue and unfounded. They were still embedded into medical schools, public policy, and research institutions. This creation of racial categories as being biological rather than what we know, that they are social constructs. These categories and these myths about race were then used to justify unequal treatment, poor treatment, or complete exclusion from healthcare and services altogether. And the institutionalization of segregated health facilities and medical evaluation further perpetuated poor health outcomes for these communities. And again, these historical beliefs continue to show up in the persistent myth of biological racial differences in genetics, pain tolerance, and just overall disease predisposition. As we move forward after emancipation, formerly enslaved people did not enter into a neutral or equitable health system. Instead, federal, state, and local policies deliberately structured inequitable conditions that produced and still reproduce racial disparities in health. Health inequity in this era was not a product of attitudes or cultural or behavioral differences. It was the direct result of laws, institutional mandates, public resource allocation, and the deliberate exclusion of Black and Brown Americans from health promoting systems. We know in policies under Jim Crow that Black patients were either treated in separate colored wards or were denied care entirely. Many hospitals legally prohibited admitting Black patients except for emergencies, and public hospitals that were built with taxpayer dollars routinely served only white communities. So of course, we can connect the significant challenges in health that stemmed from that. Even federal policies like the Social Security Act of 1935 excluded farm workers and domestic workers, which were jobs that were disproportionately held by Black Americans, right? And this exclusion prevented millions from receiving older age pensions, from qualifying for unemployment insurance, and from accessing early forms of health-related protections. We also saw many hospital funding policies, in fact, reinforcing segregation. The Hill-Burton Act of 1946 provided federal funds to build hospitals, but explicitly allowed segregated hospitals as long as they were separate but equal. Of the thousands of hospitals funded, many were still built exclusively for white patients. And what's really important is that the equal facilities were never equal. Black hospitals received fewer beds, outdated equipment, and lower staffing levels. There were also significant policies that restricted Black physicians from having access to hospitals, and also in terms of medical school access, which continued to reduce the number of diverse healthcare providers, which that's still, we still see that today as well. And public health policy really neglected Black communities at this time. Local and state governments consistently underfunded sanitation, sewage, clean water systems, disease prevention campaigns. Studies at this time repeatedly documented these two public health systems, one well-resourced one for white Americans and the other neglected for basically everyone else. So, this had a significant impact on health, right? This policy-driven neglect shaped early disparities in things like tuberculosis, typhoid, hookworm, infant mortality, occupational lung disease. These were all issues at this time that were significantly seen in disparate ways in communities of color. So again, in this time, health inequities were the direct result of policy choices that created segregated, unequal, and inaccessible health systems. We all have talked about this, the idea that health is so connected to where you live, the place where you live. Housing segregation in the US, again, was not an accident of individual choice or benign market forces. It was a government engineered system that was designed, implemented, and enforced through federal, state, and local policy, whose consequences continue to shape the outcomes of communities of color today. In the mid-20th century, banks and federal housing agencies quite literally drew red lines on maps around Black and brown communities and neighborhoods and labeled them risky, which prevented residents there from accessing home loans and building generational wealth. And this practice, though illegal today, still has long-standing effects on housing, education, health, and economic opportunity in these neighborhoods. Again, housing determines health because it influences so many things. One's exposure to environmental toxins, their access to economic opportunities, stress and chronic stress, access to healthcare and healthy foods, chronic noise exposure, the psychosocial stress from living around concentrated poverty and underinvestment, pollution burden, the list goes on and on and on. And we have seen direct links to a range of different health outcomes. Again, the ultimate measure of segregated living conditions is life expectancy. The cumulative impact of these government-created conditions results in shorter lifespans, often by 10 to 20 years, for people living in the same city, just based upon your zip code. This is not 1950, 60. I'm talking about today. We still see these significant differences in life expectancy based upon where you live, even for people living in the exact same city. Redlined communities were systematically deprived of so many things. And again, these were not historical accidents. They were public policies that built segregated environments, and those environments produced predictable poor health outcomes. Even today, people of color are still significantly more likely to live in formerly redlined communities and thus still experience many of the inequities on this list. We can also think about the importance of education, employment, and economic inequalities. Education being one of the most powerful predictors of long-term health outcomes. Historically and currently, communities of color, because of discriminatory practices and policies, experience underfunded schools, fewer educational resources, and multiple systemic barriers to higher education. And we've talked already about some of the policy and historical roots of where this has come from. We also know that employment, gainful employment, has such a strong connection to health inequity. It is directly related to health through income, one's health benefits, stress, job safety, and exposure to a range of workplace hazards. So inequitable employment opportunities were created and reinforced by discriminatory labor policies. We also know that economic inequality is really that cumulative effect of education and employment disparities. It is a key mechanism through which racism continues to impact health. Historical and present day policies limited the ability of communities of color to accumulate wealth. And that is so important because it impacts where people are able to live, whether they can weather financial shocks, their ability to afford expensive medication, healthy food, or child care, their access to safe neighborhoods and quality schools and intergenerational opportunities. Wealth is more protective than income because it provides stability and resilience across the life course and across generations, and Black and Brown communities have been historically excluded from being able to access it. And it continues to impact health today. So I want to move now to thinking a bit about how we've talked about history, policies, all these sort of social determinants of health. But chronic stress, racism, it's not only social or interpersonal experiences, it is also a very real physiological stressor with measurable impacts on the body. Chronic exposure to racism, whether it's through the structural inequities that we've talked about, interpersonal experiences of daily discrimination, or vicarious experiences. And that's becoming a really difficult one because, social media didn't always exist. But now we are confronted with racism and discrimination and oppression that is impacting our communities, our people, even when we're not physically present to see it, even when it's not happening directly to us. The vicarious impact of watching it happen to others has an impact on our physiology. And for many of us, we haven't really sat and taken some time to think about the impact that everything that's been happening around us right now is having on our physical and mental health, right? This is something that we'll see and we'll be talking about for a very long time. But these experiences, even the vicarious ones, activate biological pathways that increase our risk for physical and mental health problems across our life course. And again, we talk about this biological embedding or this weathering, right? It leads to this chronic stress activation. Our body's stress response is designed for short-term threats, not constant exposure. When individuals face repeated racism, interpersonal or structural or vicarious, that stress response becomes chronically activated. And repeated stress leads to what we call allostatic load. And this is just a medical term that really means the wear and tear on our body that results from repeated adaptation to adversity. This can include things like dysregulated hormones, increased inflammation, impaired metabolism, vascular reactivity. When chronic, these physiological changes then increase our risk for disease. The body then is continually forced to adjust to racism. And these adjustments degrade our health over time. And of course, we can see the direct connection to a range of different mental health impacts. Chronic exposure to racism, discrimination, and oppression have been consistently shown in research to cause significant psychological harm through multiple pathways: chronic stress, trauma, increased risk for a range of mental health disorders that you see on the screen here. And this evidence really underscores, again, that racism is a fundamental determinant of mental health inequities. But as a clinician, I'll tell you, our diagnostic statistical manual doesn't really talk about racism at all. And so there are new tools that we've been using. I have an image of one on the screen right now. This is the Yukon Racial Ethnic Stress and Trauma Survey or Inventory. I use this with some of my clients who are presenting with issues around racialized trauma to really better understand how those experiences might be impacting their mental health state currently. But a lot of clinicians are never taught about these instruments, are not trained to assess for racialized trauma in mental health or physical health. And so a lot of the burden of these issues goes completely unnoticed and untreated. And of course, trauma does not end with the individual who experiences it, right? When racism, violence, displacement, or chronic deprivation occur repeatedly over time, the effects reverberate across families, across communities, and across generations. And this is a term that we call intergenerational trauma, this process by which the impacts of trauma become embedded within family systems, within community structures, within cultural narratives, and even within biological pathways. And when there's sort of this new emerging evidence that shows that chronic stress, not only does it have an impact on our hormones, our immune function, on inflammation, but also on gene expression. That does not mean that trauma is genetic, but the body adapts to stress, and those adaptations can influence the biology of the next generation. So there's really interesting research that's exploring historical trauma, and it looks how trauma of these events is actually embodied or held personally and passed down over generations, such that even family members who have not directly experienced the trauma can feel the effects of those events generations later. There's been extensive research done with the children of Holocaust survivors, and scientists have found evidence that historical traumas have an impact on us at the cellular level. Stressful environmental conditions can leave an imprint or a mark on our epigenome or our cellular material that's passed down to future generations. Individual trauma then becomes collective as it affects a significant portion of the community. It becomes compounded as it's passed down, both socially through stories, storytelling, sharing of our history, but also biologically from generation to generation. And what's challenging further is that for many of these communities, they're dealing with the intergenerational traumas of historical trauma events, compounded with the contemporary traumas that we are being exposed to now. These experiences in this sort of continuum of harm is directly shaping the health and mental health inequities of communities now and will across generations. We see that the experience of this trauma that's held in our bodies and in our genetic makeup can lead to higher stress vulnerability, can impair a person's ability to cope effectively with current stressors when they arise. And we can see remnants of this in the numerous current contemporary health disparities that communities of color experience. I'm not going to go through and read all of these, but what we see is that contemporary health inequities in the United States are persistent, they are patterned, and they are predictable. And they overwhelmingly align with racial, socioeconomic, and geographic inequities that have been shaped by long-standing structural and policy-driven determinants. These disparities appear across nearly every single major health indicator. Again, demonstrating that inequity is not incidental, but systemic. And this one slide highlights some of the strongest and well-documented disparities that we see by race in life expectancy, maternal health, infant mortality, chronic disease disparities like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, mental health inequity, and the long list of environmental disparities. And again, I want to highlight, again, it's not about the race being the causal factor. Even though we see these differences by race, it's not their race, not the identity, but it is their experience that is connected to these negative outcomes, their experiences of racism and discrimination in society. So I've talked a lot about the challenges. I've talked a lot about some of the difficulties, and I want to now move towards the end of this talk to how do we get from describing what's happening to being responsible for changing it. This really means shifting from just identifying patterns to really acting on the root causes of those patterns, especially the structural forces that continue to shape community concerns. Again, understanding that these disparities exist is important, and we don't talk about them enough, but health inequities persist persist not because we lack data, but because we have not transformed the systems that continue to produce inequitable outcomes. So again, we have to shift from just talking about it to acting on the root cause. And that leads to this fundamental question of accountability. How do we do that? How do we begin to change the systems? So I have a few thoughts and key things I want to highlight on this slide. And again, these are complex problems and they will require structural complex solutions, but we all have a role to play, even if it's just talking about the issue and making other people aware so that we can continue to move towards equity in our healthcare system. We have to, again, recognize that health inequity is a product of policy, not about individual behavior. For decades, researchers, clinicians, practitioners, even politicians have focused on individual level risk factors. We'll make sure that everybody has access to primary health care. Let's make sure that everybody has insurance. Make sure everyone has a primary care doctor. That is wonderful. That is great. But that is not going to end health inequity, because it's not just about access to care or having a PCP. Health inequities arise from housing policy, education and labor systems, environmental regulation, other economic structures. Responsibility lies with the systems that produce inequitable exposure to risk, not the communities that are experiencing the risk themselves. And this is a shift that we have to make in order to really ensure that we are looking at the development of structural interventions and not just clinical or behavioral ones. Those are important. I'm a clinician. I deal in individual interventions. They're important, but it's not going to solve this problem. We have to build equity into policy. Structural problems require structural solutions. We need to build equity into housing and neighborhood conditions, expanding affordable housing and opportunity-rich neighborhoods, reversing disinvestment in historically redlined communities, strengthen environmental protections in overburdened neighborhoods, invest in transportation, green space, and infrastructure. All of these things are going to directly impact health and health outcomes. We need equity in healthcare access and quality, of course. We also need equity in education and economic opportunity. If inequity is built into the system, we have to change the system, not the people. We have to use the data we have, not just to describe what exists, but to use it to think about how to change practice. Data collection isn't neutral. When we collect it, we have to go deeper and understand what it means and use it to develop solutions that are going to be meaningful. We have to monitor inequities in real time. And again, this drives accountability for those of us who are doing work in these spaces. And we have to center community leadership and lived experience. Communities most affected by inequity are experts in their own needs. So we have to co-design interventions with communities. We have to compensate our community partners equitably. We have to value lived experience as legitimate experience, invest in community-based organizations, and build long-term partnerships and not one-time partnerships where only some groups reap the benefit. We have to shift our institutions towards equity through culture and accountability, implementing equity-focused budgeting, requiring health equity impact assessments for new policies, again, monitoring the institutional performance of different orgs on equity goals. And this has been really tricky to do under the current administration, but it's necessary. And we have to foster cross-sector collaboration. Health equity cannot be solved by healthcare alone. If there's any message to hit home, that is it. We have to work together across disciplines. We have to work together across systems, because health equity requires systemic change, and we are too often fractured and siloed that we're not working together to figure out strategies to create solutions that are really going to make an impact. And we have to name explicitly racism as a public health issue, clarifying its root causes, avoid blaming individuals, framing inequity as preventable, and aligning our institutions with this historical evidence. Because again, this shifts responsibility from communities to the systems that must change. And as we're doing this, we also have to build in healing and repair and restorative practices, reparative investment in communities that have been harmed by past traumas, trauma-informed systems of care, truth-telling about history is critical. Culturally grounded health and mental health supports are critical. Repair is just as important as prevention. And I think we have to remember that equity really is a choice. It's not a natural consequence of time or just being aware. It is the result of deliberate choices, deliberate policy choices, institutional accountability, sustained investment, shared responsibility. Again, if inequity is created by systems, it must be undone by those very systems. And, I know we're running close on time. I saw that we are going to be extending a little bit. So I won't rush through this too quickly, but this is something I think is interesting. And this is, I'll talk about this, but there are other groups where we see this too. Often we spend a lot of time talking about what's wrong in communities, focusing on the challenges, the issues, the problems. And that's important because, again, we can't fix things if we don't know what the issues are. But we also have to think about the strengths. We also have to think about what's working in communities and how can we use that thing that's working to create positive change, not just in that community, but in others. And a really great example for me is the Black mental health paradox, which really describes this phenomenon in which Black Americans, despite experiencing all the things we've talked about today, structural racism, discrimination, socioeconomic disadvantage, discrimination, all the things, often show equal or even lower prevalence of certain mental health disorders than white Americans, and maintain powerful community-driven systems of healing, activism, and resilience. This is not because racism is harmless, but it's because Black communities have developed robust, adaptive, cultural, and spiritual communal strategies to buffer against distress and to support survival, even under the most hostile conditions. And so as a clinician, this is something I've really leaned into in my own work and in my own research. We know that in many communities of color, a lot of support often historically has come from within. And so a lot of my research has been about building capacity within communities to address their own healthcare problems. Some folks don't want to talk to a psychiatrist or a clinician, but what if people in communities that folks trust were equipped with the tools, knowledge, and skills to deliver brief interventions in their community to help support sustained change? I have a number of grants where we're doing just that, where we're training individuals in communities and senior centers and other in community centers to deliver brief behavioral interventions to reduce the potential impact of depression, creating sort of a stepped approach for folks who don't want to talk to someone but need assistance. I have another large project focusing on Black and Latinx communities, using peer educators and coaches to work with patients after they've been discharged from the hospital to provide support in chronic disease care management, using culturally relevant strategies to help mitigate and maintain their health. I'm also a professional dancer. Cultural arts is an incredibly important thing to me. I've done a lot of traveling around the world, and I've also learned that sometimes we think we know everything in America. We think we have the best strategies and solutions, but we don't sometimes, and other people can teach us things. And so I believe that the integration of cultural values and beliefs and art is a significant approach that we can use to enhance the work that we're doing. And so I've done this in a lot of my work, finding interventions that are done through song and dance and music and art. Again, seen here with Taraji P. Henson, we put health pods on HBCU campuses to provide access to mental health, but culturally responsive mental health services to communities that would not normally have access to that care, and bringing in drums, djembes, and other musical instruments to communities so that they can drum and use the power of music and music therapy that's culturally based to begin to address health and mental health concerns. And on another day, maybe I can talk even more about that. But again, as we move to the end here, as much as this work is so powerful, I know that it's not enough. And so part of my goal, and one of the things I've been so excited about having this relationship with, Edie Lassiter and this group, is thinking about how social work and medicine and policy are able to come together to think through the complex solutions that we need to address healthcare challenges, because social work can't do it alone. Medicine can't do it alone. We have to be working together, because the truth is, unless we see changes in disparities in economic stability, in neighborhood and physical environment, education, who has access to food, and what people are experiencing in their communities. If we don't change disparities in those areas, we will continue to see health inequities because everything is impacting our health. So I think I can end there. I just, the last two notes here was just the notion that this becomes even more critical right now, given what's happening in our society and the vulnerability that many of our communities are already experiencing before some of the policy changes that have placed many of them at greater risk. One of the other key things I've been trying to do, and I know you all do as well, is really amplify the voices of the people who are doing the good work. And there's a lot of great orgs in Pittsburgh, I know in Philly and across the state, that are working hard to focus on equity. And we could be doing a better job of working together, joining forces to ensure that the work is getting out there. And again, we have been here before. We are harmed, but we are also strong. We are traumatized, and yet we continue to heal each other. We face systemic barriers, but we also innovate ways to survive and thrive. We endure inequity, and we transform the very systems that created it. The dual reality is not a failure of our communities. It is a testament to our brilliance, our resistance, and generational resilience in the face of sustained injustice. And I know that we will be able to continue to do this together. So I thank you all so much for having me, allowing me to spend some time talking with you all today. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments if there are any. This is also my email address. Happy to hear from you personally, individually, if you want to send a message or share.
Thank you so much, Dr. Connor. And it does look like we have two hands. I saw one, and I'm sorry, I can't see everyone. I saw Win, if you want to come off of mute.
My apologies. I was trying to hit the react button and hit the raised hand button. Sorry.
No problem. And I did see Deputy Director Garcia, your hand raised.
Yes, and thank you so much for this brilliant presentation. You hit on so many areas that speak to me and to the work that I've put in throughout my career. But I have a specific question. In my community, the Latino community, it's almost taboo to talk about mental health issues. It's even more taboo to seek help. Have you seen an increase in this? And do you think it kind of correlates in the African American community as well?
Yeah, this is such an important question. Absolutely. We see similar trends in Black communities, also other racial ethnic minority communities as well, Asian communities, Indigenous communities, this significant stigma that exists in our communities about what mental health is. And we could talk about the historical beginnings of where that came from. Because there's some interesting things there. But I think two things. One is that what we're seeing is that in communities where folks are having greater access to education and exposure, folks tend to be like perceptions around mental health are changing slowly, particularly with some of the younger generations. They're seeing things and being exposed to things that some of our older cohorts have not. And so we're seeing some generational changes there. The more we see leaders in our communities, sort of the ones that are socially recognized, athletes, actresses and influencers, folks that people listen to and they know, and they see those folks coming out and talking about their mental health challenges, it has a ripple effect in the communities around them. We saw this, for example, when Naomi Osaka, one of our big tennis stars, and Simone Biles in the Black community, the gymnast who talked about her own mental health, we saw significant spikes after they came loud about their experiences, and other folks in those communities being willing to seek help. So one of the strategies has been encouraging folks in community, and that has to be other Latino folks who can speak the language, who are willing to come out and talk about their experiences. It does seem to have a significant impact. The last thing that I'll say is that we've done a lot of work, focus groups, and just talking to people about the different language that we use. So as an example, in the Black community with older Blacks, folks sometimes don't like the word mental health or mental illness, but they would use the word, I've been having a little bit of the blues, or I've been down and out. Changing the way that we use language to be culturally consonant can be helpful, where folks find those terminologies to be less stigmatizing than what it means to have a mental health issue and be labeled as, crazy. And this is also where I think culturally sanctioned approaches to intervention can be really beneficial. You can go and see a psychiatrist, but if we can integrate culturally meaningful approaches to healing, the rhythms that we do. I remember when I did this intervention in Florida with the djembes. This was specifically for Black patients, but a lot of the Latino patients wanted to be involved because they heard the rhythms and they connected to those same rhythms just as much as the Black folks did. And so we opened it up, and it was beneficial for them too. So finding ways to engage through culture where folks are getting a mental health intervention, but they might not even realize they're getting it. That I think is the key as we move forward.
Great points. Thank you.
Dr. Connor, there's another comment that was put into the chat. Johnny Johnson says, how do I, as a nearly 62 Black, I'm assuming year-old Black man nearing the end of his employment with the Commonwealth, talk about these issues with other coworkers about DEI when the narrative from media sources they watch demonize DEI?
Yeah. I mean, this is the challenge, right? I mean, but that's why we're having this conversation. We have to find safe spaces to talk to each other, to talk to our peers, to share the information that we know. And I know that that's tricky, but I would encourage you, Johnny, to find spaces where you can do that, whether it's your colleagues at work or whether it's in your own community, whether you have a church home or other community networks. Find spaces to share what you know, to talk to others about their experiences, because all of us having information, that's the key to change. And the more that we talk about these issues, the more that we change the narrative to these being divisive conversations and rather being conversations that are critical to all of our collective healing as a community, that's when we'll really be able to see additional progress moving forward. So I commend you for asking the question, and I hope that you'll be able to do that in your communities as well.
Okay. I'm not seeing any in the chat, so I'm going to take the last couple extended minutes that we gave to ask just one question, because you touched on it really briefly, and I don't know that many people, if you're not in the clinical world or even have just a little basic information in like psychology, you wouldn't know. But as I understand it, the United States uses the DSM
Right.
predominantly or solely, but globally the ICD is more widely used. And in the ICD, complex trauma is recognized. And so there's extensive research to show that the symptomology of complex trauma is almost identical to racial trauma. So how do we bridge that gap here in the US?
And there's a whole group of folks really that have, and this is definitely a in-discipline argument that is sort of comes up a lot. And a lot of frustration among clinicians about, using the DSM or the ICD in general, because there's also a whole fight about that, whether or not these approaches to diagnosis are they culturally sensitive in and of themselves? There's a lot, even with the ICD, there are challenges. We don't recognize clinically, we see that the presentation of mental health symptoms actually looks different across different racial or ethnic groups. A really great example of this is for Black men in particular. When we think about depression, and even some of the symptomology in the depression indexes focuses on things like feeling sad or feeling down, not wanting to get out of bed and not wanting to do things, lack of interest or pleasure, sadness, crying. Those symptoms we don't see often in Black men who are presenting with depression. Instead, we see things like anger, irritability, people who are getting up and going to work every day and pushing through, but come home and have a profound sense of loss and frustration. And so certain groups are consistently misdiagnosed with other illnesses. Black men in particular are significantly less likely to be diagnosed with depression and more likely to be diagnosed with things like schizophrenia or other psychotic illnesses, just because of this differing presentation. So there's groups who are really sort of pushing back against the way that we do diagnosis in general. But I agree with you that I think that the ICD is a much better approach. And there are significant issues with the DSM. And I'm hopeful that clinicians and other in communities who understand, and as you mentioned, some of these differences will continue to push for more culturally sensitive approaches to diagnosis and treatment. more broadly.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Connor. And we'll end with Anthony White's question. Another hard one, but I think you're equipped for it. How did you, if you're willing to share, how did you approach the conversation with your son? And could you identify with the stress or challenge involved with raising a son of color in this country?
Yeah, this is a hard one. Actually, I have a friend who wrote a book on a children's book on how to have this conversation, and I'm blanking on the name, so I'm going to send it to you along with these because I think it will be really, really helpful. I think what's hard, we want to protect our children in so many ways. But what's hard is that they're being exposed to all of this. They're seeing things. They're on social media. They're watching the snippets of what's going on around them. And if we're not the ones who are sitting down having these difficult conversations with them, they're having these conversations with other people who might not be giving them the right information and the right advice. So what I did, I sort of prepared my talking points in advance, the things I wanted to make sure that I got across and that I was able to say. I took them out to eat so that they could be comfortable, and we had a conversation about what was happening and what was, they're 10 and 13, so they might be, a little bit more aware than younger kids. They had heard a lot of this and they were happy that I brought it up. And they asked me some really difficult questions, and I had to be really honest with them that ultimately my goal was for them to be safe. I mean, I had to have conversations with them like, hey, you might go somewhere and do things with your friends, and you might be the one that gets in trouble. You might be the one, even if you weren't the one who initiated that situation, you might be the one that gets hurt. You might be the one that doesn't come home. And I know that that's not fair, and that isn't how life should be, but this is where we're living right now. And I love you enough to have this conversation because I want you to be safe. I want you to be okay. So if this happens, this is how I want you to handle it. It was difficult, but it was necessary. But I will share that resource because that book is very good for younger children in particular, where you can kind of read through the story for younger children who might need a little bit more context.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Connor. And I know we are now approaching our extended time. And I know internally the PHRC, we also have another webinar that started a few moments ago. And so I just want to thank everyone for your time and choosing to spend it here with us. A very special thank you to you, Dr. Connor, for not just sharing time and space with us, but also getting a very, very difficult and complex topic covered in such a very, very short amount of time in comparison. So thank you so much. And for everyone else externally, if you don't already follow our social media pages, please do that in order to stay up to date on everything that the PHRC is doing by way of initiatives and lunch and learns and just all of the incredible work being done here at the PHRC. So with that, we will stop the recording and allow everyone to go back to their day. But again,
Thanks,
just thank you so much.
You rock. Great job.
Thank you all so much.